Yes, again, my name is Monica Young, and I am president of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center in Tucson, a nonprofit organization that is bringing you this third Thursday Food for Thought presentation. For tonight's third Thursday's program, Old Pueblo Archaeology is delighted to welcome our guest presenter, archaeologist Dr. Kelly Jenks. I'm especially pleased to be able to introduce her because I was just reflecting while we were waiting that about 17, 18 years ago, I met Kelly, and I had just started in the graduate program at U of A, and she was assigned as my mentor. And the first time that I met her, we were both graduate research assistants at the Arizona State Museum in the Office of Ethnohistorical Research. So it ended up being kind of a coincidence. So and I've off and on over the years, I've been able to get together with Kelly, especially through SMRC's tours. So I'm very honored to be introducing her tonight. Excuse me. Dr. Jenks is an associate professor of anthropology at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, and she earned her PhD from the U of A in 2011, and she has taught in the anthropology department at Fort Lewis College for 4 years before accepting a position at New Mexico State University. She's currently associate professor of anthropology and the interim museum director for NMSU's University Museum. She specializes in historical archaeology and is particularly interested in the relationship between everyday objects and identity in multicultural settings. Excuse me, Dr. Jenks has focused most of her research on Spanish and Mexican period land grant communities in New Mexico, including San Miguel de Vado along the Pecos River and Cañón de Carnué, east of Albuquerque. I'm not sure if I said that correct. She also trains students in cultural resource management, working at sites ranging from archaic period rock shelters to historic period dams constructed by the Civilian Conservation Corps. And we are delighted to welcome Dr. Jenks back to Tucson, even if it's virtually, as this month's third Thursday Food for Thought guest speaker. This evening, she will update us on the recent archaeological survey and follow-up excavation and stabilization that the New Mexico State University Archaeological Field School has conducted there at Cañón de Carnué land grants, incredibly rocky 18th century plaza. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, hopefully with success. And if I have done this right, everybody should be able to see some of that rocky setting of the land grant. And Monica's nodding her head, so I think I did this correctly.
You did it
okay.
Right.
Hey, first hurdle cleared. Hi, everybody. It's lovely to see or meet you all virtually. As Monica said, my research focuses on the historical period, especially the Spanish colonial and Mexican territorial periods in the Southwest. And for the past few years, I've been particularly interested in learning more about this one late 18th century land grant site east of Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the rocky slopes of what is now known as Tijeras Canyon, but was formerly known as Cañón de Carnué. And a lot of my research has been, even in different time periods and contexts, has been concerned with understanding what happens when cultures collide. I'm really interested in what happens when you have people of varying backgrounds all living together and the kinds of new group identities that form, and particularly civic and political identities. And this interest has made me particularly interested in looking at land grant communities. So if any of you are familiar, and a lot of people aren't familiar with Spanish land grant communities, in the Spanish colonies, if a group of people wanted to request access to land, wanted to become landowners, they could organize and write a petition to the governor requesting for a grant of community lands. And if that grant was successful and they were given this grant of community land, they would get individual allotments for their houses and for their farming fields. And then the rest of the land would be held in common for use by everybody in the land grant community. In exchange for this, they were required to build and occupy one or more plaza-centered communities. They were obligated to sustain themselves through farming, irrigation, and the likes. They had to govern themselves. And most importantly, to the colonial authorities, they had to defend these lands and by extension, that colony from invasions. And so these land grants were often established at the margins of colonial control and were a way for colonial authorities to then kind of control and defend territory and extract taxes while they were at it. So through this process, these people became, by sort of living in and working in these communities, they became landholding citizens with kind of different rights and resources and obligations than they would have had otherwise. And a lot of these land grant communities attracted people from varying backgrounds. Oftentimes people who were poor and pretty desperate and in order to make more opportunities for themselves. So it's been a really interesting sort of context for me to look at what it means to form group identities. And because I'm an archaeologist too, I'm looking at this not in terms of sort of the ideas people have in their head, but in terms of the lived experience of thinking about, when we think about who we are or how we identify with a group, oftentimes thinking in terms of doing certain types of activities with stuff like this, objects and things in a particular place. And so I study the things and the activities and the places to better understand that experience and that transition to new ways of identifying as part of a group. And that was a long introduction to me, and now I'm able to move past those photos of me very quickly to talk more about what I'm here for today, which is to talk about this project at Cañón de Carnué. So the project that I want to talk to you about today happened because of interest from the Cañón de Carnué land grant community and the city of Albuquerque's open space division. So, sorry, I need to get this little viewer out of the way of my screen. So now I'm back. Moises Gonzalez, who is a professor of urban design at the University of New Mexico, but is also a land grant heir and for a time was the president of the Cañón de Carnué land grant, contacted me back in 2017 because he was interested in learning more about the archaeology of the land grant community. And he was particularly interested in learning more about this site. It was the old Carnué village site on the west side of the canyon that was to be or thought to be the site of the original 1763 grant of lands to the Cañón de Carnué community. So it was the first Cañón de Carnué land grant. And when we first spoke about this, that site had fallen out of control of land grant heirs. It was privately owned, but owned by somebody unaffiliated with land grant. So there wasn't a whole lot that we could do. But in 2021, the city of Albuquerque purchased that land, and they worked with the land grant community on a plan to manage that site. And one of the first steps in that plan was to do an archaeological survey in order to be able to better understand and manage this property. And so the land grant community invited me to bring the 2021 NMSU Archaeological Field School to survey that site and to map and record it and provide recommendations. So we did that. And then based on those recommendations, there were some additional things we thought would be really important to learn. And so we asked and were allowed by the land grant community and the city's open space division and by the state to come back in 2022 and do some test excavations and some restoration work within the component of the site that is known as the North Plaza complex. And this is the part of the site that is associated with that 1763 land grant community. So the rest of this talk is going to be focused on what we've learned about that settlement in the past few years. Just to give you a little bit of spatial context, so this site, the San Miguel de Carnué site, is located east of Albuquerque in Tijeras Canyon. That's where the little red arrow, if you can see it on your screen, is pointed on the right side. It's kind of between two mountain ranges, the Manzano and Sandia Mountains, and it's this part of this mountain pass, right, that connects the Rio Grande Valley to the west, where Albuquerque was located after 1706, to the plains on the east side. This site, this old village site, has been known by a lot of different names over the years, and that's for various reasons, including that it has had different visits by archaeologists over time. It turns out that it was the site of a 1946 field school run by the University of New Mexico, a really huge field school immediately after World War II, that we don't know as much about as we want to because there were no reports and we haven't been able to relocate any maps or field records. However, in 2022, right before actually we came back with the field school, we were able to relocate those collections that were recovered from their field excavations. And they're in the Maxwell Museum presently, and I'll come back to that. Another source of confusion, so each of these different visits by archaeologists have resulted in different names for the site. So it's been known as the site of the Plaza of San Miguel de Laredo. It's been known as the Silva site or the Selva site because it was actually near Selva's bar and saloon. That 1946 field school, for reasons, called it BE9. The actual site number is LA12924. And for simplicity's sake, I call it San Miguel de Carnué. So I'm going to stick with that name going forward. Another source of confusion is that there's another site about a mile to the west of this one that is also thought to be affiliated with the same land grant. And that site's known as the Singing Arrow site, or LA12315. And it was excavated by Al Ward in the 1970s, and again, much more recently by the Office of Contract Archaeology. So I'm not talking about that site, but I'm also not that far away. And just because it's cool. So the picture on the left is one of the few records of any kinds we've been able to relocate from that 1946 field school. Apparently, according to the student newspaper article, the summer Lobo article that I found this photo in, it claimed to be the only field school in the first field school that summer that admitted women. So there's actually quite a few pictures of women looking much more glamorous than I do in the field, working at this site. Also on the right, one of the things that has made the site even more rocky and a bit more complicated than it might otherwise be is that just to the north of the site, what had previously been a wagon road was later sort of relocated, and they constructed what became known as Route 66, which was kind of constructed through this and when they rerouted from Santa Fe. And it was actually pretty popular at the time, this drive through these kind of big boulder slopes. It's kind of like similar to if you've driven east from Tucson through Texas Canyon, it's kind of a similar look. And then later in the 70s, it was changed again to become Interstate 40. And the construction of I-40 resulted in a lot of major construction and sort of dynamiting of rock to form access roads, and a lot of those boulders ended up site as well. So it has a complicated history full of all kinds of site formation processes, and as somebody trained at the University of Arizona, this is very exciting. So that's a little bit about the site. Here's some photos of our surveys and later some of the excavation and restoration work. And this is a map of the component of the site that I'm talking about. So this is the North Plaza complex. And as you can see, hopefully on this map, you have a series of rooms organized around sort of an open space in blue here, and that's the plaza. The shaded areas in the south are areas that had been obviously previously excavated with mounded dirt around them, and in some cases, piles of dirt. The south of them that were the back dirt generated by the 1946 excavations. Some of this might have even been from earlier UNM testing in the 30s. From what we could tell, the back dirt was not screened because that wasn't as common in the methods of the time to actually screen through the dirt for artifacts. It was more important to kind of get to the floor and see what was on the floors. And then the portions that have these green areas around them are the places where we did test excavations in 2022. So we were trying to get some excavations within previously unexcavated rooms, but then also do some tests in areas where we weren't sure how much intact cultural material was left. And that was especially true here in the Northeast. And then we also were trying to address some of the erosion that was happening because of this old open trench that cut through the south rim block wall. And so we actually excavated a back dirt pile from that 1940s excavation and screened the sediment and used it to try to partially backfill and stabilize this trench to minimize some of the erosion that was happening. Okay, so this is the historical period, so we do have some written records relating to the history of this land grant settlement. And all of the previous research and then our field research has seemed to indicate that that North Plaza complex that I just showed is associated with a short-lived settlement that was occupied by the first Cañón de Carnué land grant between 1763 and 1770. So here's what we know kind of in brief about that settlement from written records. 19 men applied for a grant of community lands in this canyon east of Albuquerque. We don't actually have that initial document, but we do know that in February of 1763, their application was approved by the colonial governor. 2 applicants were excluded because they didn't qualify. One of them wasn't married. He later got married and was able to join. And the governor also stipulated when he approved this grant that it was to be used for farming on the Eva, as opposed to ranching. And this is probably out of concern that livestock would be captured in raids because this land grant was in the east, kind of at the margins of colonial control in a place that was in danger of raids by particularly Apaches and Comanches. Excuse me. So, I'm getting ahead of myself. So on February 12th, the alcalde mayor of Albuquerque led 17 families, the ones who were approved, to the mouth of the canyon, where he laid out a plaza settlement. He dedicated it to San Miguel de Laredo, did all the song and dance that one does in the colonial period when you were officially dedicating land. And then he measured out and assigned house and farm allotments. He dedicated an area as an orchard, and then sort of said in what directions and how much distance the land grant extended. It was a relatively small grant and a relatively small community as far as such things go. There's only the one plaza community that was established. And so it appears that they never actually named an official, like a person who was sort of a civic authority for that land grant, and they never established a church. These are things they would have gone back west to Albuquerque for. So we don't have many records relating to the actual occupation because it was pretty short, and unsurprisingly, the records that we do have are what happened when somebody got in trouble. So the first of these is that in 1765, the assistant alcalde of Albuquerque gets busted for not getting permission first before allowing trade to happen. And he allowed for the trade of 4 horses, 2 calves, maize, and some flour to a group of Carlana Apaches in exchange for 4 mules and some salt and 10 deer hides was the going rate. The next bigger sort of criminal investigation that happened that referenced this community was that in 1768, Pedro Crisostomo, sorry, I always hit that backwards, accused, who is a resident of the land grant community, accused several of his neighbors of stealing and then either butchering or selling cattle. And in the investigation that happened, two of these men, Gregorio Montoya and Francisco Garcia, ultimately confessed to stealing cattle from Old Pueblo and then either butchering or selling them, particularly to several of their more powerful neighbors who, interestingly, were never punished for this. The men themselves ended up having to make restitution. And then the third man, Bartolo Ansures, apparently found a cow that belonged to an Albuquerque man out on the plain between Carnué and Albuquerque, which he killed and butchered for food. And when he was accused and then investigated, he explained that at this time, it was really impossible and it was forbidden to hunt because it was so dangerous. There was such a fear of attacks around that village. And so his family was starving. And so when he found this cow, he butchered it so he could feed his family. And he was ordered to repay the owner a cow and a calf, but otherwise wasn't punished. And that's it for what we hear about the occupation of this community. In 1770, in October, the village was attacked, and the survivors retreated to Albuquerque for the winter. And in April of the following year, well, actually, so in the spring of the following year, the governor ordered them to return, probably to start planting the fields. And there was apparently a short and unsuccessful attempt on the part of some of them to do that. And in April 10th of 1771, those who had attempted and come back, actually 14 settlers signed a petition indicating that they couldn't go back. It was too dangerous to live there. They couldn't do it. The governor denied that petition and tried to get them to go back. He said he wanted them to finish fortifying the plaza, which suggests that they never quite finished. And he also got the alcalde mayor of Albuquerque to try to organize a meeting and bring in a bunch of Genízaros from other areas to try to persuade them to also go out there and resettle this community because it was such an important defense point for the colony. Nobody was persuaded. Things were that bad, that dangerous. Nobody was willing to go. And so finally, the alcalde of mayor of Albuquerque, when he has no success, he orders the settlers to return with him on May 27th of 1771 to go to the land grant community to demolish their houses and forfeit the grant. And there we go. And so that is the last thing that we know of that happens out there in an official documented way for a number of decades. Much later, sorry, this is what happens when I do animation, I forget to hit the button. Decades later, in 1818, a group of families from Albuquerque petitioned to settle these lands again. And in 1819, the colonial governor at that time approved that grant. And this is the establishment of the second Cañón de Carnué land grant community. And that's the community that's still there today and the ones who have invited and then permitted me to work on this settlement. So that is our historical context for this community, to give you some sort of illustration of where we're talking about. This is a map that was produced, or a copy of a map that was produced by Bernardo de Mieri Pacheco in 1779, so only a few years after the abandonment of this settlement. And he actually has it on the map in the canyon, interestingly kind of represented as several small ranches rather than like one community, which might be significant. It's on this drainage, so there's actually a creek that runs in the mountains and then it goes underground and ultimately drains into the Rio Grande, just south of Albuquerque. And so, and to the east of this mountain pass is territory that, particularly in the 1760s and 1770s, was very much associated with Comanche and fell within Comanche territory. Okay, so who lived here? What do we know about the people who lived here now? I'm going to start again with what we know from historical records, particularly from research done by the historian Francis Swadesh, who identified a total of 28 named heads of households in records relating to this community. Though she estimated that probably a maximum of 25 families would have lived here at any given point in time within that short history. And she also thought, and quite a few people think, that it's possible and maybe even likely that these families were spread out through the land grant as opposed to living in one sort of fortified plaza community the way that they were instructed to do. That was actually something that was not uncommon at that time, and it would kind of match the illustration we have here from not much later. So according to her research, most of the heads of household that were listed in these colonial records were identified as Españoles, and this indicates that they either thought of themselves, or at least they passed for what was considered to be Spanish at the time that these records were written and in this context of colonial New Mexico. 3 of the men, all of the men who were accused of stealing cattle in 1768, were identified as Genízaros. And this was a term that was used in colonial New Mexico to describe indigenous people who were part of the colony, usually and especially indigenous people who were taken captive and sold into colonial homes. If they were freed, or if they had children and those children were free, but of indigenous ancestry and fully kind of integrated into the colony, they were often called Genízaros. And then another 3 men were described as coyotes, meaning that they were of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry, probably Hispanic and Pueblo heritage. And one of these men is the man, Pedro, who accused his Genízaro neighbors of stealing the cattle. Francis Swadesh also noticed that a number of the family names were ones that were really common, particularly a few decades later, in the Boreles community, which is was and still is sort of a neighborhood south of Albuquerque, not too far actually from where the Arroyo empties into the Rio Grande. So they seem to possibly have some community connections to that area. So that's what we know from the historical accounts, but what does the archaeology tell us about who these people were and where they were from, who they interacted with, all of these things. So most of the artifacts that we've recovered from this site are pottery fragments and animal bone. It's generally sites of this period, colonial sites of this period. It's something like 3/4 pottery, 24% faunal bone, and 1% everything else. And that's mostly what we're finding at this site. The best indications we have of migration patterns or trade patterns come from the decorated pottery. And Jason Vandervoort, who is a master's student at NMSU, analyzed the pottery that we recovered in 2022 as part of his master's project. And when we look at that data, when we look especially at the decorated pottery, most of it was obtained locally from communities, some but not all of them Pueblo communities, living in the middle Rio Grande Valley. So we have, for example, Ranchitos polychrome here. This is Ranchitos polychrome sherd. This is produced mostly in a community associated with the Tamaya, or also known as Santa Ana Pueblo. This is a community that shifted to the Rio Grande kind of near Bernalillo at about 1760. We also have a fair amount of minimally decorated, it's called red on brown, but it sort of looks like red on orange pottery, often known as casitas red on brown or isleta red on brown. This is pottery that's produced, if you have kind of the Ranchitos polychrome coming from up here. The red on brown is produced down here by Isleta Pueblo and also in a variety of these communities sort of along the Rio Grande. It's using a lot of the sand, the river sand as temper. We also have a small amount of Pueblo pottery coming from communities further west, like Armor and Zuni, but a lot of it is really that middle Rio Grande stretch. And then there's a handful of fragments, pottery fragments, that are being imported from central Mexico. And these include This is a fragment of Mayolica, probably manufactured in central Mexico. We have a few fragments of this. I'm pretty sure it's tonalá polychrome, which is interesting. That's a decorated pottery type, common pottery type from sort of the Guadalajara region of Mexico. And at least one fragment of Chinese porcelain that would have been imported from kind of imperial China, probably through Acapulco into Mexico and made its way up. So you do some things that are coming up for as part of the immigration of colonists from central Mexico or trade with that region. So overall, this looks like the residents mostly came from or interacted with communities living between Bernalillo and Isla in that part of New Mexico. So all the extended Albuquerque area. And some of them probably had historical or family connections with central Mexico. So why did they sell this place? Why here? The colonial governor had really strong motivation to approve the land grant because he wanted to protect larger and more wealthy settlements along the Rio Grande from attacks by Apaches, by Comanches living in the east. And by settling these mountains, he created sort of a buffer. He made the grantees responsible for providing that defense. But for the people who petitioned for the grant, they were settling a place they knew to be pretty dangerous. So why? And this is something that Alison Uecki, who is another master's student, explored in part of her master's research. It's just, again, where we are relative to sort of colonial communities and what they consider to be enemy territory. So the benefits for the settlers, one is certainly the obvious one, which is that it's an opportunity to get land. So a lot of the people who were sort of applying for these kind of land grants were people who didn't have land, they didn't own land themselves. They oftentimes didn't have a lot of resources. A lot of them in this time in New Mexico would have been working within the partidario system, which basically they'd be shepherds. And the partidario system is kind of like sharecropping, but with sheep, where you are responsible for caring for somebody else's herds and you earn sort of a percentage of the new lambs or fold if you're able to successfully grow the herd. And it's much like sharecropping, something that people could oftentimes scrape by a living on, but not a good living. It made it very hard to sort of improve your lot in life. And so the opportunity to have land, even if it was pretty dangerous, was still oftentimes viewed by people as an opportunity to improve their lot in life and have more resources and more opportunities for themselves and their families. This was also probably familiar territory, given that it looks like these people are coming largely from kind of the extended Albuquerque area, and a lot of them are probably working as shepherds. This would have been that plain between the river and the mountains was the plain where a lot of grazing of livestock happened. And so this is probably areas that they knew from kind of living and working beforehand. So they weren't coming to territory unknown. This would have been familiar to them. Another major reason for coming to this specific place is water. You have a creek that runs through the canyon, and it's not that far west of here that creek goes underground. So this is a place where there is water, and that was there pretty reliably. It's spring fed, and there's a few springs in this area, including one that's actually probably very near this site because there's pretty consistently water in the creek just below this site, more than you would expect if there wasn't sort of a spring feeding into it very nearby. Another really important factor, and something that is actually was specifically advised in kind of colonial documents of the time, was that there were nearby remnants of earlier settlements. So the sort of advice in colonial documents was to seek out and sort of settle areas with existing ruins, right? Because not only does that give you supply building materials, but it also lets you know that somebody has managed to eke out a living in that place before. And as I've mentioned briefly before, this was a multi-component site. So I'm focusing on the land grant component, but there was an earlier occupation. There was a Pueblo occupation, meaning occupied by Pueblo Indians during the early colonial period, sometime between sort of the 1540s and 1680. And there were remnants of smaller, earlier occupations in the pre-Hispanic period as well. And what this means is there's building material, there's rock, and mud for adobe mortar. And that would have been pretty attractive as well. And finally, there's opportunities for trade. As Danes to occupy the East at this point, the opportunities to trade with groups further east is something that was desirable. And we see that in kind of the one document talking about trade in this area. And this is just to illustrate some of these points and an opportunity to show reconstructions that were done by Dennis Holloway, who's an architect who did this, working with the land grant community and with some of the data from the field school. So he was able to take some of our field records and plan maps and create a three-dimensional representation of what the community might have looked like at that time. So you can get a sense of how close they were to the creek. You can actually see a photograph of a creek over here to get a sense of how much water is usually consistently available, even during sort of the hot and dry periods. Okay. So another question, and probably the most interesting question to me, is what did people do here, right? What was their day-to-day life like? How did they build their homes? What types of food did they eat? What did they do? Where did they go? The overall sort of answer I have in terms of what did they do here is mostly they stayed close to home. This has been one of the main takeaways that we have based on our research so far. And if you remember when I was talking about historical records, one of those records describes Bartolo Ansures as the Genízaro man who was accused and confessed to stealing somebody else's cow and butchering it to feed his family because it was too dangerous to leave to grazing. Based on what we're finding archaeologically, that seems to have been true most of them that the settlement occupied. The archaeological records include a lot of faunal bone, right? And we've been able to analyze the faunal bone from the 2022 field school, but also from that earlier field school in 1946 with the Permissional Museum. Bones were analyzed by Jocelyn Vallis, who is a graduate student with the assistance of Ronnie Alexander, John Alexander. What they reveal is that people were heavily relying on domesticated animals, especially sheep and goats. Not a small number of cattle, all of which is kind of interesting for a community that was supposed to be a farming community and not a ranching community, but really shows the extent to which they are relying on the animals that they have brought with them and raised, as opposed to going out to hunt. We see some cottontail jackrabbits, but these animals that are much more likely to come close to the settlement and can be opportunistically trapped and killed and eaten as they venture into the gardens, for example. But there's very little evidence that residents ever hunted deer in the surrounding mountains. Was surprising to me initially without really thinking about the context of it, because there are a lot of deer in the surrounding mountains. So this is much more important and much common now and in the more recent past. We also have a lot of evidence that the animals were being kept within the village as much as possible, or kept as close to the village as possible. Probably if they were being grazed, it was to the west, closer to Albuquerque rather than to the east. Some of this, if you look in the picture on the left, we found this wall that's on the left side is kind of the outside courtyard wall of one of the residential structures. And there is a wall extending perpendicularly out from that into the plaza. And so what this appears to be is a corral or an animal pen being constructed at the plaza. So they were probably penning and keeping animals in that plaza space, along with kind of some of the other activities. I also like there's, just as while I've got the picture here, there was a really clear kind of dump deposit of charcoal and ash
between these two walls. And what it looked like is the people who lived in this room were probably coming directly out their door and dumping the waste from their fire pits right there. And that's not really surprising for this time period, but it does also kind of add to the idea that people were staying things as close to their homes and as close to the Plaza settlement as possible, and not really venturing too far outside if they didn't have to. We also know that people were keeping animals in some of these rooms around the plaza. So the picture on the left is actually this unit right down here. So right in this unexcavated portion is a habitation room. This is where somebody was living. And then just north of that is this room that we tested. And it was clearly used as an animal pen or barn. So it was kind of more simple construction. They actually modified and pecked away part of this natural boulder and incorporated it into the wall. It had an uneven, pretty thin floor, and that floor was capped with a thin layer of manure. So another set of insights into this past, into what people's lives were like, comes from looking into some of the rooms. So we had test units in a couple rooms. One of those rooms was an animal pen. One was pretty scavenged and destroyed by rodent activity. But one of them was actually in really good condition, and we're seeing a portion of this room here. And we have this nice corner fireplace. This is a basin-shaped corner fireplace, the base of which was still intact. It's relatively small. This is probably something that would have been in a bedroom or like sleeping quarters, as opposed to sort of a bigger fireplace that would have been used more for cooking. And this is over here on the right is a picture from Rancho de las Golondrinas, just to give, if you haven't seen one of these quarter fireplaces, it would have been more simple than this one, but it would have looked something like that. So it's hard to see from this side of the picture, but if you look at it in profile, another thing that was interesting about how they were building and living in these rooms is that they actually, the room floor was a dirt floor, and it was prepared. So they kind of excavated down, leveled out, and sort of laid clean dirt or adobe to form the floor. But the surface of the floor was about 5 to 10 centimeters below the base of the exterior rock walls. So if here is where you have the base of the rock wall, it's down here is where we find the floor, which is interesting. This is a really rocky area that would have been challenging to do. So it looks like they were excavating down sort of inside the walls to create a lower floor surface, and maybe for the purposes of leveling it, I'm not really sure, or maybe it was kind of better for temperature or better for defense, but they were building the floor below the base of the walls. Another thing that we find, so this is my favorite find from the site, and I get more excited than anybody does about this, but on the surface of this fireplace, there were a few rocks. Most of them have been removed except for this one in this picture, and they seem to be, they kind of had burned, heat damaged surfaces, so they seem to be functioning as pot rest, something that if you were resting a pot over the fire, you would be resting them on these rocks. This one looked kind of interesting in its shape, so when we picked it up and looked on the bottom side, what we saw was that it had been probably repurposed from an earlier use as an abrader. You have this groove carved through the center. And this is the kind of thing that you see, especially in Pueblo and pre-Hispanic sites, as a tool that can be used to sort of smooth down the edges and straighten things, right? Especially things like arrows for bows and arrows, the arrow shaft or the shaft of the spear. So this is interesting for a few reasons. My favorite thing, though, with this artifact is that it had clearly been modified again. So if you can see, there's these little points that have been carved into it, and then lines scratched into it. So, and it has kind of vaguely triangular shape. So somebody took this object and also carved toes into it, and it was sitting toe side down on the top of the fireplace when it was left. So somebody made it into a little foot, and I don't know who, I don't know why, I don't know if this is the kid who was living here who thought it would be funny. I have this fantasy that that was being used to actually heat up the rock to use as a foot warmer, and that somebody was doing a colonial period pun, turning it into a foot. But it is my favorite artifact and really cool, and so I just wanted to show pictures. But I can also talk about what else it tells us about the lives of people here, and the kinds of tools they had access to and the kinds of possibilities for defense. So it's very possible, and in fact, probably pretty likely, that this was an object that was recovered from an earlier occupation and then modified for this later use. But it's also possible that the land grant settlers themselves were using this to straighten arrow or spear shafts. One of the things we know about these land grant communities is that they're typically not that well armed, right? They're the people who are applying for these more peripheral land grants are doing so because they don't have a lot of resources. So even though they were supposed to be able to defend these settlements, metal weapons, muskets especially, but other kinds of metal weapons were oftentimes in short supply, and pretty expensive. And you have to remember too, this is colonial New Mexico. So to get anything that is sort of metal all the way up to colonial New Mexico, it has to be imported. It's supposed to come all the way from Spain through central Mexico and then overland all the way up to New Mexico. That's a tremendously far distance. There's no nearby ports. And so most of the metal that does come up is used to within an inch of its life. So we don't find a whole lot of metal, and what we do is oftentimes scrap. And that's what we found here too. Tanner Guski actually did his master's research looking at all of the metal artifacts that we recovered in 2022 and all the ones that they found in 1946. And mostly what he found is that they were really extensively modified and reused, oftentimes to the point where it was really difficult to tell what they had been. The one on the bottom here that looks like it is something that has been turned into something else, sort of the handle of something else. This was actually sitting on the floor of one of the residential structures. One of the best looking metal artifacts we have is also unfortunately one of the weirdest. So this artifact on the top is made of copper, and it was recovered from one of the that backdirt pile that we were screening to stabilize the trench. So that backdirt presumably was generated through excavations in these rooms around the plaza, because that's where they seem to have been focusing that UNM project in 1946. But if this is a copper crossbow, what it looks like is that it probably dates to the Coronado expedition of sort of 1540, which was unexpected. And it's entirely possible that it's something that either came through with the expedition or maybe more likely came with Pueblos who were fighting and retreating from conflicts in the area of Bernalillo. So probably Tiwa-speaking people taking refuge in the mountains and maybe bringing this crossbow bolt with them. And that because the bolt was sort of in the site, it may have fallen into the dirt, or it may have actually been reused by the people living here later in the land grant settlement. So it's a very cool artifact, but we're finding it in a very secondary context. So that's our other metal artifact. Okay, one of the last points I want to make about this gets back to sort of the bigger question of defense. So these land grant communities, one of the big things that they were supposed to do is be able to occupy and defend these lands. And that was certainly the reason that they were granted permission by the colonial governor to occupy this pass, was with the idea that they would defend what was otherwise a pretty dangerous mountain pass. And they were supposed to do so by fortifying and enclosing a plaza. But it's not really clear that they ever did. And in fact, there's some reason to think they didn't, including the governor ordering them in 1771 to go back properly fortify their plaza. Unfortunately, this is something that's really difficult to say definitively that they did or didn't do from the archaeological record. If you look at this site map, there are gaps in the southeast and the northwest. Most likely these were intentional. If you look at other land grant communities dating to this period, there's usually sort of entrances and exits for a road that would cross through, or a pathway that would cross through. And oftentimes they're kind of in the southeast and northwest. So these might have been places with kind of gates or other blockades, but probably never had rooms there. But the northeast has a lot of open space, and that's a lot harder for us to say anything about. And this is why we had some of these test units here in the northeast. So if you look at this kind of area depicted on the map, this is actually a push pile. And there was blading work that was done in the northeast that resulted in a lot of this area getting scraped and a pile of dirt being pushed here. And as a consequence, the tests that we've done show that it was bladed all the way down to sterile, like it's sitting on decomposing granite. So if anything had been constructed, even just fence poles along that way, we don't have any evidence of it, but we also can't say that it didn't exist. In the north, we have a different problem, which is that we're not only dealing with a lot of boulders that were already on the site, and then even more that were thrown onto the site when they were blasting away to create one of the access roads. We also have a case of sort of the neighboring property right away clearing their land by pushing those boulders down right on top of the stretch. And so there's no obvious room alignments, but it's also really obscured by very big, very heavy rocks. And so that makes it a little bit hard to what's happening in the north too. Okay, just a final point on that while I'm thinking about it. It wouldn't be uncommon if it wasn't fortified. That's something that oftentimes happened in these communities, even though they were pretty endangered and they were supposed to build fortified plazas. Oftentimes they didn't because they wanted to be closer to their lands, and it was probably in some cases safer for them to spread out than to present a nice, attractive target all in one place. Okay, so last kind of thoughts about the site. How did it end? We already know it ended badly, right? That it was attacked in 1770 and the survivors fled west, but that's all that we know from the records. None of the records actually say how many people were killed or how they were killed. They don't describe the attack, right? To talk about sort of what kind of battle happened, what took place. And it's not even really clear from the records who attacked the settlement. It's often sort of implied that these were Gileño Apaches, but it's not entirely clear that that's accurate. One of the questions we had between the two seasons was, did the site burn? And we wondered about this because if you look at our map here, all these little orange dots are from burned adobe, and it was really burned adobe fragments. Some of them were burned to the point of vitrifying, like they had turned into glass. And so one of the things we wondered is if part of this attack involved setting the structures and the roofs of the structures on fire so that it could burn hot enough to create this really fried adobe. You see an example of it over here. Unfortunately, it's a really difficult question to answer because the places where we see a lot of that burned adobe is in the south, and that's the portion that was excavated by UNM in 1946. And that's an excavation for which we don't actually have any records of what they found in those excavations. We have the collections, but we don't have any notes or maps or photos of what they found. We had one test unit in the southwest corner in 2022 that did come down on the edge of what appeared to be a really burned feature, but it was just the edge and it was the end of the season. And so there wasn't sort of the time or opportunity to expand the excavation to define that feature. So that's kind of an open question. But the rest of the rooms that we tested in the Northwest, none of them are burned. We have no evidence that the room burned. We also never found any roofing material, remnants of roofing material on or above the floors. And so what this suggests is that all of these structures that we tested in the North and Northwest were ones where the residents probably did come back when they were ordered to destroy the structures, salvage what they could of the wood, and then probably knock down the walls. And this leads to a couple of the other interesting things that we found too. So this is part of an earthenware bowl that was left lying on the floor, probably broken and therefore left behind. And then this is probably the weirdest thing that we found. So this was also right towards the end of the season. We had been kind of leaving some of this rocky area alone until we could determine if it was a wall or wall fall. And we finally figured it was wall fall. And as we were starting to remove the area underneath it, we found this is an intact skull of a juvenile cow. It is almost really intact, including the really delicate cranial bones here in the back, at least up until we exposed it and tried to take it out, and that shatters immediately. What this suggests to me, it was sitting on the floor right next to the fireplace. The fact that those bones were preserved indicates that it was placed there probably with flesh still on it and buried pretty quickly and right underneath that collapsing wall fall. So that indicates that people deliberately placed it there shortly before they destroyed the room. I don't know why. It is an unusual thing. And as we've been going through the 1946 collection, there's a few other mysterious things that we're discovering. One of these is that we found there was a conus shell, so that's a marine seashell from ocean contexts, a whole one that was recorded as being recovered from sitting on the floor of one of the excavated rooms in this land grant plaza. There was also, and this is the one that really gets to me, a horse skull, more or less intact horse skull. The tag only indicates that it was recovered from a room, but looking at the dates that it was recovered and other things recovered from the same room by the same people, it was on the same day that they pulled out most of the ceramics. So it was probably, if not on the floor, pretty close to the floor. And the last find is that there's, which was kind of a late discovery, one of the people at the Maxwell Museum later found, when they were moving some of the whole pots, found what to me appears to be a sheep effigy pot. It's definitely a matte polychrome, looks like it's 1760s, similar to the ranchitos polychrome that we're finding. And this is something that had the tag of the site on it. So we don't know where exactly in the site it came from, but we know it came from that site. We know it dated to that time period. Given that it was whole and mostly intact, I suspect it was also recovered from a floor, but that would be really difficult to prove unless I can find more notes. So with that final sort of intriguing mystery, I'm going to leave it there. I'm hoping we can learn more things to try to help us solve these mysteries, or at least answer some and then come up with some new questions as we keep working through the 1946 collections with the approval of the Maxwell Museum. And I'm also hoping that we might get the opportunity to go back and expand some of those units we weren't able to finish before, particularly the burned area and the room with the cow head in it, to see if we might get a little bit more context to help us figure out what's going on in those areas. And I want to acknowledge all of the many people and land grants and offices and departments and institutions who have helped us along the way, and see if anybody has any questions. And I know somebody else has to say something first, so I'm going to stop talking.
Kelly, that was very interesting. Thank you. So before we address the questions and comments from the audience, I'd like to ask Aldart to give you some information about Old Pueblo's mission and activities.
Okay, let me share my screen quickly here. Bring it up full screen for you. I just wanted to let people know some information about Old Pueblo Archaeology Center. We're a nonprofit organization established to do education and research programs in archaeology, cultures, and history. Our mission is to educate children and adults about archaeology and other cultures, the preservation of archaeological and historical sites, and to develop a lifelong concern for the importance of non-renewable resources and traditional cultures. Some of the ways we implement our mission is we offer educational tours to sites of archaeological, historical, cultural interest. Some of the tours we have coming up are mostly, they're all in Arizona currently. A couple of tours coming up at the Picture Rocks petroglyph site and Los Morteros Hohokam Village site in northwestern Tucson, one in September, and we'll also be doing one in December now. So you can still register for either one of those. Well, I'm sorry, the September one's full. That's this Sunday. So we're opening the registration for the December tour now, which will be on the winter solstice day. And on November 2nd, we'll be doing a tour to the Badger Springs Wash and Badger Springs Pueblo and some petroglyphs in Agua Fria National Monument up north of Phoenix. And we do have some spaces left on that tour now. It was filled for a while. Starting early next year, Dr. Vance Holliday and Mr. Kilpatrick, who's a docent with the Friends of the San Pedro River, and I will be leading a tour on the Upper San Pedro in Arizona, which ranges from Paleo-Indian Clovis period sites at the Murray Springs site through historic period mining sites. Something to hopefully satisfy everyone. And there's actually a few petroglyphs there as well. And then in February, Felipe Molina, who is a Yaqui historian here in the Tucson area, he actually lives in Marana, will be leading a tour to some of the historical Yaqui settlements in the Tucson and Marana area of Arizona. So all these tours are currently open for registration. We also do classes and workshops. I'm currently doing an online course in Hohokam culture of the Southwest. And we do have, if somebody wants to still get in on that, we've done 3 sessions out of the 14 so far, and we are recording the class sessions, so you can still get into that if you'd like. We're also offering an arrowhead making and flint knapping workshop in November with our flint knapping expert, Sam Greenleaf. We have an online presence. Our next third Thursday Food for Thought program will be with Dr. Jacob Sedek, who is a graduate of the University of Colorado, and he's going to be talking about some DNA evidence primarily from Mexico, but relating that to some of the little bit of DNA evidence we have here from the southwestern United States. So another thing we offer online is we have a semi-monthly email series where we try to publicize archaeology, history, and cultural related activities throughout the Southwest, other organizations as well as ourselves. And we send out emails twice a month to publicize these, and you can get onto our emailing list by going to our website. It's just oldpueblo.org, and scrolling down to the bottom, you can put your name and email address in to get onto those semi-monthly emails. One of our main programs, and the one we spend the bulk of our money on, is children's education. We have a simulated archaeological dig set up at our facility in Tucson, which is on a Tucson Unified School District property. So we're always looking for donations and grants and membership revenues to help support that program, because we do have paid employees working on that. So you can go to our webpage, our homepage, and donate through PayPal if you want to there. We also can take checks, or you can call in, credit card authorizations. I'll give you some information that they actually put it in the chat earlier. So basically tonight, we're kind of passing the hat, requesting donations, asking people to become members of Old Pueblo if you're not already. And I'll take a look in the chat for the web pages you can find to do all that kinds of stuff. Yeah, it looks kind of like this without the illustrations. So that's all I have to say. Monica, you want to take it up to the Q&A?
Great. Okay, so we have several questions for you, Kelly. One question is, can you tell us more about the story of how you found the artifacts? I love data detective stories. I think she's referring to when the artifacts were discovered at the
In
museum.
the Maxwell?
I think so.
Yeah. Me too. I love doing the data research. And in fact, I'm weirdly excited about trying to figure out what I can do with the original field tags that are with some of the bulk artifacts and trying to reconstruct how they laid out the site. They didn't use a north-south grid at that time. I think I know maybe how they laid out the site, but I'm still trying to figure out the details. But they knew that the field school had happened. There were some of the previous surveys mentioned kind of hearing about, and there being obvious surface evidence of an old UNM field school. They knew who had directed it. I always screw up his name. It's Paul Writer. It's Reiter. I've been corrected, and all it means is I can't remember which is the wrong way now. But he was at UNM. Do you have it?
I believe it's Writer.
Writer. Okay, thank you. It was Dr. Paul Reiter was the director of the field school. It was a giant field school with close to 60 students, if I'm remembering correctly, that they had split into two groups and that were working at two different sites. And one of them was like a Pleistocene cave site west of Albuquerque, and the other one was this one. I knew the date, and I started searching through newspapers, like any kind of archival records available through the digital sort of archives for New Mexico, and then anything I could find in newspapers. And that's actually what gave me the best start, is I found a couple of the sort of publicity articles that you often get with field schools in the Albuquerque newspaper and the Santa Fe newspaper. And some of those articles gave specifics about when the season started, when it ended, where the students were coming from, who the director was, who the field assistants were. That because he had these two different projects, he had grad students really running fieldwork at the two different sites, and so some of their names were in there in spellings. And then there were a couple of student newspaper articles in the Summer Lobo, the sort of student newspaper at UNM, published in the summer, where they actually went out and they took a few photographs. And so the one photograph of the woman who's sweeping the floors came from one of those articles. And I went to the archives at the Center of Southwest Research at UNM to see if there were any other records associated with that. And so, and some of those photographs, some of the original photographs they had like the names of the students who were depicted spelled out and where they were from too. So what I ended up doing was kind of compiling a list of everything that I knew about when the site was excavated, the dates, all of the people who were involved at any level, the director, lab assistant, any of the students who were pictured and had names, and sending it to the Maxwell, and particularly Karen Price, who's the manager of the manages the archaeological collections, along with Carrie Schleyer, who's the curator for the archaeological collections. And Karen was actually able to match some of the names that came up, the student names, with this weird mystery collection that she had. That was a site that went by the name BE9, that was old, that there was very little information about. Somebody at one point had thought it was, I think, Cameron Creek. But then in kind of going through and repackaging things, a few of the tags said Tijeras Canyon. There was a horse in there. So it didn't really make sense, but they didn't know what it was. And some of the names actually matched. So that was how we found the collections, which is really exciting, because when we were heading to do that sort of second field season and do some test excavations, we knew that a lot of the land grant portion had been excavated, and just figured that the collections had existed but were lost. One of the things that is still a big challenge, so Ryder directed the projects, but he died not long later. So this is 1946, and it was in the early 50s, I think maybe 53 or 54. He died in Chicago, and from what I understand, it was suicide. And he wasn't getting on particularly well with family, potentially at the time. And so it's not the case of, the elderly academic organizing all their notes, filing them with the museum so that everybody can find them again. Like his records were not organized, were not handed over. I think the family had sort of mixed feelings about taking a lot of this stuff. I think some of his students apparently collected some of his records and held on to them for years and passed them down. There was a set of those records that were turned over to the Park Service that related to his earlier field research at Chaco, and I'm still hoping to look at those. They say they don't have anything after 1942, but I'm hoping some photographs made their way in. And I'm hoping that at some point somebody stumbles across something and we find field journals in a file somewhere in the archives at UNM that we luck out and get more information than we did, because I know he was taking photos. I know there would have been maps. But it is possible that a lot of that stuff got thrown away after he passed away, and there weren't people sort of wanting to keep it. So I'm really excited we have the field records, or the collections. And I'm excited that we have bag tags in some of those that give us some context, and I'm hoping we find more.
That sounds like great detective work.
The archaeology of
right. You had mentioned earlier about the settlers with the first land grant settlement, that they had to go back and destroy the structures. One of the questions was, why destroy the structures?
Yeah, I want to call it passive aggression, but it's not that passive, is it? It seems to have been partially as punishment because they would not go resettle, to sort of really make it clear they were forfeiting the grant and losing their homes there. But I think it was also out of concern that those structures and any improvements to the land that they had done would be used by groups that the colonial authorities didn't want to be any closer. So particularly some of the Apache groups or Comanche groups, that they were worried that leaving those resources there, leaving houses there, would make it sort of an easier place for them to occupy and stage raids from.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wasn't actually certain, because you oftentimes, well, you would know, Monica, like you oftentimes get orders to do things that are described in records, and just because somebody said it should be done doesn't mean that it was ever done.
Right.
So I was actually not that we would find evidence that they had that, but I think that is what we're seeing in those rooms without roofing materials. I think that's when they went back.
Aaron says, glad to see that the foot rock made it into the presentation. Will there be a field school at NMSU this summer? And if so, when will applications open up? You know who this Aaron is?
They're in my classes. Hi, Aaron. I'm glad you enjoyed the foot rock. I love the foot rock. I show it off in every opportunity. It is the coolest thing I think I've ever found. There is going to be a field school. It's not going to be this one at this site. My understanding is that Dr. Tom Hart, who's in our department, who's a paleoethnobotanist and works in Belize doing Mesoamerican archaeology, which is very cool, is planning on trying to lead a field school program of some kind to his project site in Belize. And it's a project that UT Austin has been largely doing a lot of the field work out there, so you're part of a bigger team. There will be a field school. With Carnué, I'm actually meeting next week with some of the folks from the land grant and open space to talk to them about what, if any, further work they'd like to have done, and if they'd be interested in having us come back to do some more. So there may be sort of small opportunities to do short field projects, and it might be I do a field school there again. I'm kind of waiting to talk it out with them.
Well, it sounds like you have some anxious students. Kathleen says that she just drove through Tijeras Canyon this afternoon, and she says, can one visit that site?
So it's not open for visitation by the general public because it is a multi-component archaeological site. And so it's something, the city was purchasing land along Tijeras Creek, partially, really the broader effort was to preserve and restore the water, the drainage that kind of comes through there. So this is a portion that is controlled by the city, but it's not publicly accessible unless you were escorted there by open space or by the land grant community. So the land grant community still has access so that they can visit and care for the site as well. There is information. So the other site probably connected to this land grant is called Singing Arrow. And it is near the Singing Arrow Community Center, which is open to the public. The site itself is fenced off. I'm not really sure why there's not much of it left, but it's a big field with a fence around it. But the community center has an interpretive display that talks a bit about the history of that area, and it includes sort of, it's a very cool plot. It's not actually from the Singing Arrow site, it's from Las Huertas north of the Sandias, but it has some artifacts like associated with that time period. So, and the city of Albuquerque's, the open space division also has, I should find it and send it to Hal afterwards, they have a story map online that has information about Tijeras Canyon as sort of a cultural corridor that talks about some of these previous occupations.
So are the settlers there? I mean, the community grant, land grant owners or settlers there, are they considered site stewards of the site?
Yes. They certainly, the land grant, they consider themselves to be stewards of the site, and they've worked really hard to, are concerned about the site and do consider that one village in particular to be ancestral, and they also consider themselves stewards of the earlier occupations to try to protect it. So they were, I mentioned before, it was privately owned. There was a lot of concern about it being developed during that time period, and a big part of the reason why it wasn't, other than all the big rocks, is that the land grant worked really hard to protect it, and they were also part of getting it sort of helping sort of support the sale to the city, with the idea that the city would also then protect it and enable them to continue to care for it.
Who better to be the site stewards, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Joe Ashcroft says, over too soon, great info. I'm assuming you know Joe. Is there going to be more efforts to survey more of the canyon and surrounding areas in the East Sandia Mountains?
On the east side, that I don't know. So I am open to doing, if I go back to do another field school, one of the things I had talked to the land grant community about is if they had interest in having survey and documentation done on lands that they control. Because I do have a general permit in the state, and teaching students to do surveys is important for them if they want to work in archaeology. So I'd be happy to help with those efforts. A lot of it, what survey gets done depends on who owns the land. And so there has actually been a lot of survey in the canyon sort of in advance of the interstate, which then obliterated a lot was there. So there are some of those records already. The Forest Service, the Cibola Forest, manages a lot of the lands in the Sandia and Manzano Mountains, and they've done some of the survey too, surveyed some of those lands too. And the rest of it, a lot of it it's land grant or private land. And so it kind of depends on whose territory. I know there was some survey done around Paco by Dr. Mark Lysette and Bill Leckman, who is also somebody who helped me on this project. We're doing some survey around that area. So there are pockets that have been surveyed, but there can always be more.
Julie Nasser says, great presentation, Kelly. I knew the foot would come up here. It is a fascinating artifact. Love the inclusions of Jason's, Jossie's, and Tanner's research.
This is another former student who was classmates with those three. Yeah, I try to warn people if they've done research with me, I might embarrass them by congratulating them in a public forum. They did great work. It's the only way, it's how we're able to learn so much, is having a lot of students who've been willing to work with this material. It's been really helpful.
And Julian Duran says, also great seminar. It's great to see more of this history to help build around the Spanish and Pueblo historical connectiveness. And that looks like all the questions and comments. So yeah, so on behalf of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, I'd like to thank our guest speaker for sharing with us this evening. And we also thank all of you in the audience for joining us. And please consider making a donation to support Old Pueblo's efforts to educate children and adults about archaeology, history, and cultures, including through programs like this one. And thank you all, and have a nice evening.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Kelly. See you next month.
See you then.